Welcome to this webinar on insights from research on research use. I'm Ruth Neild. I'm a researcher at Mathematica and also a member of the board of directors of the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness, or SREE. We are very pleased to welcome to today's webinar Dr. Vivian Tseng. She is the Senior Vice President Program at the William T. Grant Foundation. Vivian leads the foundation's programs, its grant-making operations, and its initiatives to connect research, policy, and practice to child and youth outcomes. Of particular relevance to our webinar today is that in 2009, she launched the foundation's initiative on the use of research evidence in policy and practice. Since then, the program has funded over 60 research studies of research use, and through its work has informed the grant making of private and public funders across the country. Importantly, she has been a leading advocate for the systematic study of how research is used in practice and policy, and what can be done to better promote research use. She has also been instrumental in expanding the field of research practice partnerships in the United States. So today, what Vivian is going to discuss is what we have learned about the use of research evidence in policy and practice, including when, how, and under what circumstances research is used, and what it takes to improve the use of research evidence. Before we get started, SREE would like to acknowledge the William T. Grant Foundation's support for this webinar and for several additional webinars on research use that we are planning for this spring. For this first webinar, we really wanted somebody who could provide a broad overview of what we know about research use. And our thoughts immediately turned to Vivian, and we are thrilled that she has agreed to join us.
Thanks so much, Ruth. Ruth has been such a wonderful colleague on this journey in trying to advance the use of research evidence in policy and practice. So I was just, when she emailed me, I said, of course, Ruth, of course I will present. And I see many good friends and colleagues on this video call who have also dedicated so much of their lives and their careers to making research matter in the world. So I'm so glad to be with fellow travelers on this journey. I'm going to talk today a lot about the foundation's work on studying the use of research evidence in policy and practice. And in doing so, I'm going to try to also draw upon colleagues who've been working on these issues in other organizations and indeed around the world and in sectors so different from education. One of the things that's been amazing to me is that there are so many common themes when it comes to making research matter in the world. And I'll share some of those with you. From a personal standpoint, I have to say that this is almost like an obsession of mine. I went into research because I thought research could make a difference in the world. I really wanted research to make a difference in people's lives. I was hoping that research could help us bring about a more just society. And research was the contribution that I wanted to offer to that larger enterprise. But I think, like maybe many of you, was frustrated because although you can do great research, it doesn't mean that it gets used or that it's actually even seen as useful. And so I've spent a good part of my career trying to figure out, how do we solve this problem? How do we make research more meaningful and used in policy and practice? I've been very lucky because for the last 16 years, I've been at an organization, the William T. Grant Foundation, that shares my interests and my passion. The foundation's mission is supporting research to improve the lives of young people. So not just supporting research, but research that actually improves kids' lives. And we think about this as, in order to do that, we need to support research that actually informs policy and practice. And I think this is very similar to SREE's mission statement. I went in on their website last night and I pulled up the statement that SREE is dedicated to advancing research relevant to practice. So there's the organizational mission. And I bet for many of you, your career and your personal mission is also something similar along these lines. So I think of all of us as collectively really invested in figuring out how to make this happen. Now at the foundation, we had to be kind of honest with ourselves in saying that while we were supporting a lot of great research, we were very proud of the research and the researchers we were supporting. People were doing rigorous work. It seemed to us like they were studying important questions and problems. The peer reviewers, that they had to go through a rigorous peer review process. Peer reviewers said it was great work. But at the end of the day, the research didn't seem to us like it was being used. It wasn't really touching the lives of young people or the practitioners who work with them, or certainly it wasn't doing it often enough. And let me be clear, we could tell you great stories. They were often stories told with 20/20 hindsight. We could look in the past and say, here's a case where research was used, and we'd have a great explanation for why it was used and what happened. But we did not have any kind of systematic understanding of what we could prospectively predict when, how, and under what conditions research was used, nor did we have well-grounded thinking about what it would take to produce more useful research or to get it used. So what we did is we figured, we're a research funder. We can turn this problem into one of rigorous scientific inquiry, right? So we can turn this problem of research use into one that we study in rigorous ways. Luckily, there's a lot of great early research that we could have referred to. In the 1970s and 80s, there was sort of this outburst of interest by folks like Michael Patton and Carol Weiss, who were studying this problem of why isn't research being used in policy? And there was a wonderful sort of bevy of ideas that came out. Unfortunately, that work died out in the 1980s, and it just didn't persist. So when we came along around 2008, we thought, well, let's see if we can revitalize, revive, and grow this body of work. And the way we thought about it is, one, we need to approach this work with some strong theory. And I don't mean grand social science theory that tries to explain everything in the world. I mean theory very simply in terms of explanatory frameworks. Frameworks that can help us explain and predict when, how, and under what conditions research evidence is used, and how to improve its use. And within those explanatory frameworks are testable propositions. So we can bring some empirical rigor to testing out some of those ideas. And that's really important because many of us in the field have hunches and notions about what it takes to get research used, but we have not turned them into testable propositions and empirically validated whether our hunches are correct. And so theory is no good without this empirical rigor that I've been talking about. And so we have really tried hard to support studies that are not only grounded in theory, seek to build and test theory, but they're also empirically shoring up our evidence base on how to get research used. So strong research design, strong methods, and strong measures. I think it's also a very exciting time to be thinking about these issues because we're in a large and burgeoning field. At WT Grant, we've invested about $25 million in over 60 studies over the last dozen years. Our good colleagues at IES under John Easton's leadership, and when Ruth Neild was at the agency, when Tom Brock was at the agency, invested $10 million in 2 national research centers on this topic. And there have been a few other funders, National Institute of Justice and others outside of education, who've also funded these studies in recent years. And we are part of a growing international cross-sector group of scholars and funders doing work in this area. Everything from environmental policy to international development to healthcare to education. And so it's a really exciting time for this field of scholarship. So giving you sort of a taste of what the big picture looks like, I'm going to now dive into some bare bones basic concepts. So we're talking about the use of research evidence, and it's really useful just to try to get clear on what we think it means to use research evidence. I think a lot of us have implicit assumptions or ideas about what it means to use research evidence. And many of those ideas follow a simple linear model that we do research to identify what works. We get other folks to implement what works. You scale up what works at larger and larger scale, and then outcomes will improve. It's like a rational linear model of research to practice to outcomes. Another version of this you see communications folks talk a lot about is you do research to generate important findings. You communicate those important findings, and then outcomes will improve. And if you think around, a lot of our initiatives have been designed around these very simple linear models of how to get research used. Now, it's appealing, the simplicity, the parsimony is appealing in many, many ways. But unfortunately, when people study the use of research evidence, they find that it's never that simple, nor is it that linear. Instead, it's much like a busy, busy freeway system. That even in those times when research does come into policy and maybe comes to influence outcomes, there's a lot of other things going on at the decision-making table. Folks are often looking at their local data. So in school districts, folks are looking at their administrative data and using it to try to understand who their students are and how things are working. Folks are also thinking a lot about funding. What are our funding constraints? Are there funding streams to fund this stuff? Where's the professional development dollars going to come from? So that's coming to the decision-making table. People are thinking a lot about implementation capacity. Do we even have the capacity to make this happen? What would it take to make this happen? In public agencies in this country, folks are also paying attention to community input. So in school districts, they have to listen to the voices of teachers and parents and community members. And so that often comes to the decision-making table as well. When people are making decisions, they're not just looking at data or evidence or what communities are saying. They are also bringing with them their own histories and experience of doing this work. So they're bringing to the table their own professional judgment. So they're thinking about, how did past reform efforts go? What did we learn from this? What do we think is likely to happen with this round of reforms or changes? Politics inevitably come to the policy-making table as well. People are thinking about, what are the political ramifications of the decisions they make? What's the political support? What's the political resistance going to be? Do they even have the political will to take on some of these changes? And that's a natural part of decision-making in our society. And of course, people are bringing their values to the table. They're thinking about their own values. They're thinking about their constituents' values. So when we think about the use of research evidence in policymaking or in practice even, it doesn't look at like that rational linear model, that country road where everything's simple. It's actually quite complicated. And there's a lot of different factors: research, other types of evidence, and other considerations that come to the table. So when we're interested in the use of research in policy or in practice, we have to think about how research sits alongside all of these other forces. And although I put each of these factors independently, it's not that they act independently, right? So for example, research can be used as part of making a political argument, right? It's not that these things act independently. They can become melded together. Or maybe local data is used to identify the problem. Research is brought in to help understand how to work on that problem. So I show this slide just to show that there's a lot of different things going on, and they interact quite a bit. There are also ways of thinking about different ways that research is used. The most common way that people think about the use of research evidence is in terms of its instrumental uses. And this is when research is used to make decisions. So for example, someone comes to a crossroads, there's a decision to be made, and research provides the information they need to help them decide one way or the other. For a lot of folks, they've thought about this in terms of programs, especially in the research community, maybe among SREE members. They've thought about research evidence as helping folks decide which programs to adopt. Or at the federal level, you've seen a lot of attention in the last 20 years focused on using research evidence to make resource allocation decisions. Tiered evidence initiatives like I3 were based on the idea of putting more money towards programs with more rigorous evidence of effectiveness. But that perhaps also oversimplifies what instrumental research use looks like. Because it doesn't boil down easily to one singular decision, even if that decision is an adoption decision about a program. Usually what you see is a stream of decision-making where different types of research or other types of evidence are used to help folks move along a stream of their decisions. So for example, even if in the beginning folks look at evidence of effectiveness that helps influence them to perhaps look into a certain program and perhaps even to eventually adopt it, there's a whole chain of other decisions that need to be made about how they're going to implement it, how they're going to manage the professional development that's involved, how they're going to align it with their curriculum or their assessments or all these other things. And none of this is a smooth linear process. It can also abruptly stop and restart. You know, a pandemic happens, or there's a crisis that goes on in the district. Funding stream is no longer available. All of these things can create fits and starts in any stream of decision-making. So if we're interested in getting research used in decision-making, it's critical that we understand what this stream of decision-making looks like, what kinds of decisions are being made, and how different kinds of research can be useful. Another big bucket of ways of thinking about research use is its conceptual uses. So this is not research being used to make a decision per se, but rather research that can inform how people think about a problem or orient themselves to different issues, right? And this is so important because how people frame an issue, whether they see it as a problem, how they define the problem, frame the problem, is so critical because it will shape how they seek to solve it. It'll shape what kinds of solutions they're willing to look at and which ones they aren't, right? So this conceptual use of research evidence can actually be quite powerful. And research can be used conceptually simply to help people better understand the nature of a problem, to investigate and understand the root causes of some of the problems they're trying to solve. Conceptual use does not get nearly the kind of attention that it deserves. And yet, when you talk to policymakers, they often will say that they're much more likely to use research conceptually than instrumentally. And I think that's very interesting because I think what researchers often aim to do is to get research used instrumentally. And we may be missing out on some opportunities. Karen Bogenschneider more recently has been writing about another way that research can be used, which I'm calling relational uses. And we often think about research in terms of its informational value. It provides a piece of information that's useful for understanding a problem or making a decision. But there are also ways in which research can be used as part of a relationship. So in state legislatures, research can be called upon and used to help persuade others in the legislature, your colleagues, to come along on certain bills or to vote in certain ways. Research, they will say, can also be used to improve the quality of dialogue, the quality of policy debate, to raise it to another level. Research can also be used to help build consensus. So in Washington State, Gerald Herding has studied how local community actors have used research around adverse childhood experiences, the set of traumas that young people face and the negative consequences of them, to help build a community consensus and coalition about the kinds of problems that they want to work on together. So there's a way in which research can actually help build alliances and consensus for forward movement. So having laid out for you a variety of different ways that research can be used, I want to dive in a bit and talk about the importance of understanding the policy process. Because if we're interested in the use of research in the policy process, we have to understand the policy process itself. Otherwise, we will completely miss the boat in trying to get research used in the policy process. So what I'd like to do is take you through a case study example of the use of research in the policy process. This is some wonderful work conducted by Lorraine McDonnell and Stephen Weatherford, two political scientists. And they use the Common Core as a case study. And it's actually a great case study, because the proponents of Common Core were very, very explicit that they wanted the Common Core to be based on research and evidence. And they were quite intentional about setting up processes that would enable research and evidence to come centrally to the table. And so what I'm going to do is walk you through their study of how research came to be used at different stages of the policy process, from defining the problem to developing the standards, which you could think of as the policy, the standards being the policy, to the adoption of the standards. I'll also note here that the Common Core, although there's been a lot of political debate about it, the Common Core was adopted by 45 states. So in that sense, it was quite successful for a while. Of course, there was a lot of political blowback, and that shifted the direction of some states. But even as all of that settled down, when we look across the country, the vast majority of those 45 states maintain the Common Core, or something that looks very much like the Common Core. So when we think about, this, you could call it the initial stage of just finding the problem and the solution, you find that there were key actors who were leveraging research to make the case for the Common Core. And prominent among them throughout the whole process was the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. And they drew on research that showed low achievement of US students compared to global competitors. So some of these international studies that looked at, how are US students comparing to other students. They tied it to other evidence that showed that it was countries with higher achievement have national standards. And then if you look back at the US, there's vast variability in state standards. And they pieced that together, all of that, those different pieces of evidence together, to define the problem and to offer up the solution of Common Core. Benchmarking for Success was this seminal report that was put out by NGA, CCSSO, and Achieve in 2008. And look at how they framed the argument for the Common Core and the evidence behind it. They said, we recommend adopting a Common Core of internationally benchmarked standards in math and language arts for grades K through 12, to ensure that students are equipped with the necessary knowledge and skills to be globally competitive. So you see what they're doing there as political actors. They're crafting the political argument for the problem based on these different pieces of evidence. As they shifted from defining the problem and offering up the solution of Common Core, they shifted more towards the development of the standards. And again, there's a whole group of key policy actors who are involved, NGA and CCSSO, still at the core leading the way. When it came to developing the standards, the math standards, they were able to rely on research on learning progressions. Luckily, there had been quite a bit of good research, especially in the early grades, kindergarten to second grade, about how to sequence what students would need to learn in math in these early years. Now, like with a lot of areas of research, there are gaps and there are holes. And there was not great research on what those learning progressions should look like for older students. And so, but they had promised a set of K to 12 standards. That's what they were advocating for. That was the policy. And so what they did is they brought in researchers' professional judgment. Researchers had to extrapolate and make inferences about what the learning progressions would look like for students who were older. They also brought in mathematicians to seek their judgment and input into what this might look like. So this is important because it's not just empirical evidence that comes to the table. It's empirical evidence. It's also researchers making inferences and bringing their professional judgment to the table. You know, when it comes to policy, there are multiple policy actors, right? So teachers' unions were also involved in the standards development. AFT and NEA, the two teachers' unions, gave input on the standards. AFT, for example, convened a group of master teachers. These were teachers that often mentored other students. They had a lot of experience themselves. They reviewed the standards and provided input to the standards writers on things that were going to be unclear and made suggestions for how to improve the standards. In addition, the team brought on state education agency staff to provide their input on the standards. And they particularly looked to SEAs that were had reputations for having really strong standards, and they wanted their input on how to make the standards better and workable. So you see again that when it comes to even something like the development of this math standards, it's research coming to the table, but coming to the table with a lot of other dynamics going on. I should also note that as part of the standards, you know, there was a validation committee. A validation committee, 19 or 20 of the 29 members of that validation committee were researchers. And they were explicitly charged with reviewing the standards in terms of whether it was grounded in research and evidence. So there was I just say this to say, there was a real process developed to try to get research built into this policy development. Now, as the policy process moved on and the challenge became getting the standards adopted by states, the key actors really shifted more to state boards of education who would have to make those adoption decisions. NGA, CCSSO is still very much involved, as well as some other groups. And at this stage of the process, it really wasn't a lot about formal research. There wasn't a lot of formal research that was evoked to get the standards adopted. Instead, it was a lot of state-by-state comparisons, and it became much more of a political campaign involving messaging toolkits and things like that to build up support. So the key here, I think, to think about is that when we're interested in the use of research evidence in the policy process, we really have to understand how the process evolves, who is involved, who are the key actors at different stages of the policy process, and be prepared to understand that research can serve different functions at different stages of the policy process. And different types of research can be valuable at those different stages of the policy process. Sometimes if we're too limited in just thinking about research on what works, research that makes causal inferences, valid causal inferences about the impact of a program, that may have some utility at some point in time, but it's very narrow in terms of how it fits into this broader policy process. Okay, so I've made the case that you got to understand the policy process. You got to understand the decision-making process if you want to get research used. You also got to understand who the research users are and what context are they working in? What are their decision-making contexts? And who are those decision makers? And here I'll refer to you to a couple of studies done by the National Center for Research on Policy and Practice. You see their logo at the top there. Two centers funded by IES. This first one, led by Bill Penewell and Caitlin Farrell, was part of a national representative survey of 1,000 of the largest school districts. And they asked folks, when they do use research, what did they use it for? What were the problems? What was the purpose of using research? And you see there in the fourth bar that only 9% of these folks said they used research to select programs. Another 9% said they use research to support and monitor implementation, but that's implementation writ large, not necessarily of evidence-based programs. And you see a much larger percentage of folks saying things like they use it to support their own professional learning. So again, these conceptual uses of research to just help them design policies, programs, initiatives, to provide instructional leadership for others. So I show you this slide. I don't want us to scrutinize the numbers here. What I really wanted to use this slide to show you is that there's a range of reasons, and these are district and school leaders, but there's a range of reasons why they use research. There are different purposes for research. And so it's useful for us. It really behooves us, as researchers, to understand to what ends. What are people using research for? We should also think a lot about who these research users are, who's involved in using research. And this is a survey conducted by the Center for Research Use in Schools, which is another IES funded, the second IES funded center. And again, I don't want to get caught up in all of these numbers. I show you this slide from their survey, national survey, to show you the wide range of people that are involved in decision making. This one is at the school level. So you see everything from principals, teachers, curriculum and instructional supervisors, assistant principals, instructional coaches, special educators, district superintendents, school board members, research and evaluation staff, central office staff. There's just a huge array of people that are involved in decision making. And again, I don't want to get too far into the numbers. I don't want to overstate these. I think the basic point here is that we need to understand the nature of decision-making in districts and in schools. And the reality is that most of it is a social process. It's not one individual sitting in his or her office, their office, making decisions, going out, searching for research, making sense of it, and then applying it. Most decisions occur in groups. There are task forces, there are working groups, there are department meetings, and they involve an array of key people. And so when we think about who we're engaging as research users, who we hope will take up and use our research, we need to be thinking, have those folks in mind. And I love this analogy I heard from a colleague on a panel that I did a couple of years ago. And he likened it to being at a restaurant, right? Where a customer puts in an order for, a dish that he would like, but the waiter comes out with a different dish. And I think that's what happens too often in education research. We are not delivering the food orders, the dishes that the customers say that they want. And in fact, I would go so far as to say we have an entire kitchen of chefs and prep chefs and a whole industry going on in our back kitchen that's making a whole lot of food that the customers sitting in the restaurant did not actually order. And so part of our challenge in the research community, in this enterprise of research, is to figure out what we need to be doing to help line up what folks say they want and need to solve real education problems and what it is that we're producing. Otherwise, we're going to have this weird thing where the food keeps getting sent back to the kitchen. I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and talk about what influences the use of research evidence. You know, I've focused a lot here on understanding the nature of the policy process, the nature of decision making, who are the decision makers, and all of that. What I'd like to do is shift gears a little bit, take us up to a higher level of how do we make this use of research evidence go better. The factor that, and it amazed me in the beginning, that comes up again and again is the importance of trust and relationships. This is not what I anticipated when I started out on this work a dozen years ago. But what you hear and what you see in findings, whether it's an environmental policy, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in education, whether it's in child welfare, whether it's legislators, whether it's executive branch agencies, is the importance of trust and relationships. That decision makers really think about, can I trust not just the evidence, but the purveyors of the evidence? And when it comes to trusting the evidence, they don't think about exactly the same terms that researchers do. As researchers, we often think about trusting evidence, the credibility of evidence in terms of what research design was used. Can they make credible inferences based on the design and the methods that were used? Do they follow the scientific method? Was it peer reviewed? We actually have a pretty well-defined set of standards for that. But when you hear from or talk to policymakers and practitioners about how they come to trust evidence, you hear a different set of factors. You know, that they will evoke more, is it relevant to me? Does it fit my context? Does it fit the problems I'm trying to solve? They'll talk a lot too, not even about the evidence itself, but about the purveyors of the evidence. Who's sharing the evidence? Are they people who have come through for them before in the past? Can they, people that they rely on to deliver the information that they need, who understand the problems they're trying to solve, who understand the context that they're working in? And so it's those trusted relationships that really shape their trust in evidence. Relationships then also become key in how they make sense of the research and how they come to evaluate it, right? And so it gets into their hands through relationships, and then their sense of trust in it, how they make sense of it and interpret it. Also, a lot of that comes through relationships. That's why peer relationships are very important. So someone in one school district may call up their colleague in another school district who they think is operating under very similar conditions to see what they make of what their the research is, what they're hearing. Intermediary organizations who are trusted also become very important purveyors or sharers of and co-interpreters of evidence. These can be technical assistance providers. These can be professional associations. They can be advocacy groups or certain advocacy groups for policymakers. And so trust and relationships, key. Second is it really, really helps if research use is built into people's work routines, meaning it fits into their stream of work, that it's not a special event. You know, if as researchers, we keep trying to throw these special event occasions when people will use our research, it's probably not going to go very well. We need to think more about, and this is by understanding the policy process, understanding decision-making routines is important, because I think our goal is figuring out how to make sure research comes into play, there's room for interpretation and constructive and productive uses of research in the work stream as part of people's everyday work. When this happens, time, pulling out time to do these things is not quite as difficult. It's not the challenge because it's already built in to their work routines and their everyday work. Now, you could think about it as embedding research within existing work routines. You could also think about it as shifting work routines so that they, shifting, I think about the stream, shifting the direction of the stream, right? So that it can folks can better engage with research in an ongoing, iterative way. The last thing I'll call your attention to is capacity building. And I don't think we have nearly enough research on what it means to have adequate capacity to use research well. I think many folks have been interested in, and to some extent have studied, the technical capacities that are needed. And by technical, I mean things like adequate data systems, staff with adequate research expertise, research departments. It's sort of the technical skills and staff to do this work. I would just caution, though, given everything we know about the use of research evidence, about trust and relationships, there's a social side to this capacity building that also needs to be there. And in fact, when people have studied say the absorptive capacity of school districts or state education agencies, they find that the quality of relationships among staff or among different units or different departments in an agency is very important, because that shapes their ability to learn from each other across the agency, to pool together the knowledge that's needed to do this very complicated work of education. And that's also about trust. How do they engage their different colleagues or also external partners? So I would just urge folks to think hard about the social side to this capacity problem and how to address that. And of course, there are other things that we've only begun, we're just scratching the surface of leadership. What is it that leadership does to put in place routines, resources, policies to foster organizational capacity to use research evidence? And I really hope this is an area of research we will really grow in the coming years. So where are we at? I'll tell you where we're at with the William T. Grant Foundation. We have called for a 3-part research agenda on research use. And we would love to welcome the SREE community of folks to help us work on this agenda, because we need a lot of talent and smart people working on these issues. And we've broken it down to 3 parts. One is strategies to improve the use of research. We need rigorous studies to identify and test ways to improve the use of research evidence. So we know relationships and trust matter, but how do you build those where they don't exist? Or how do you strengthen them where they do already exist, but make sure research comes to the table in meaningful ways? Or how do we leverage existing strong networks, maybe peer networks between school districts or between state education agencies, in order to improve the use of research evidence? How do we make this stuff happen more often, better, and more productively? We need strategies to improve the production of useful research. That's like what we're doing back in the kitchen. What are we making back there? What do we need to do to make our research more useful? And that's why we and many others have an interest in research practice partnerships. This idea that when researchers and practitioners jointly define the research agenda, it's more useful to the practitioners, and then hence the research is more likely to be used. But we need many more studies about that. What does it take for partnerships to be successful? There's a lot of great ideas out there, but we should be rigorously studying some of those. Or what are the conditions under which partnerships or other kinds of co-production activities are successful? What does it take? What's the capacity needed on the district side? What's the capacity needed on the research side? What are the processes that need to be in place? Are there certain kinds of issues that lend themselves better to this kind of work? There's a whole host of questions that we need better answers to, and that will enable us to produce more useful research. And last, we're interested in studies of how and under what conditions using research improves outcomes. It's too easy to assume that if people search, or if they just use high quality research, outcomes will improve. But it's not nearly that simple. The real world is much more complicated. So we need to understand what it takes for research to be used well in order to improve outcomes. So thinking not just about the quality of the research, because researchers like to focus on that. Is it rigorous research? Is it high quality research? But also, what about the quality of how that research is used? Is it applied appropriately? Are people making good inferences? Is it fitting into their decision-making processes in productive ways? And what does it take? Because ultimately, our goal is to improve outcomes. But what does it take for research and the use of research to lead to those downstream outcomes that we're hoping for? I'll add two very exciting new layers to our own initiative, which I'm personally just really thrilled that we're doing. The first is that we need more robust methods and measures at scale, because as we shift to thinking about how to improve the use of research evidence, we need more scalable measures. A lot of the rich findings we've gotten have been close and very, very time-intensive observational measures where people follow a school district for a year as they make decisions about their math curriculum, about their math pathways, and do a lot of interviews and review documents. That work has been very valuable. I think it will continue to be very valuable. We also need measures we can scale so that we can start to test out some of our strategies to improve the use of research evidence. So I'm going to share these slides so anyone who wants these resources can find them because they're linked in. One thing we've done is we commissioned Drew DeTomer and Kevin Krause to produce a compendium which reviews different methods for studying the use of research evidence. It talks about document analysis, observational protocols, surveys, interviews, and social network analysis, and discusses both the pros and cons. All methods have strengths and limitations, and he goes through that to help people make better choices about how to study this stuff. He is also, with a bunch of colleagues, developing an open access measurement repository so that anyone who wants to use these measures, these protocols, can have access to them, understand how they were developed, what they're good for. If they want to adapt them, they'll have more information on about how to do that. Look for that later this spring. And then the perhaps most exciting thing that we're doing is really taking a critical race lens on the use of research evidence. Our country is undergoing a racial reckoning, and so many of our institutions and other areas of work, I think, are also doing that important self-reflective work and thinking about how we can do better to meet this moment. And that's no less true when it comes to the use of research evidence. We've too often assumed that if people are using research evidence, it'll lead to good things. But that's really an assumption. And if we look back at our historical context, there are many, many instances when research has been used to justify racism, to reinforce racial hierarchies. And so this is causing us to take a really good, candid look on the ways in which racism is imbued in the research production enterprise, in the research use enterprise, and figure out how we can improve the use of research evidence to help bring about a more racially just society. And we don't assume that will happen on its own. And so we put together a wonderful panel about this, and if you're interested, you can watch it on our website. And my colleague, Fabienne Doucet, a program officer of the foundation, has written some wonderful essays the last 2 years on these topics. And so I'll refer you guys to those as well. Again, I was sharing these slides, so don't feel like you have to take notes. We'll share them out with you. So I will stop there and I'll turn it back to Ruth and see if there are questions.
There are indeed questions. And thank you, Vivian, for that enormously thought-provoking presentation, asking us to slow down in some ways and question our assumptions and think about what we think we know and what we still need to know. So we have a number of people who have questions, and I have chatted with each of them. So I am going to call on them. I just want to let you know, so it doesn't sound like I'm just like calling on them out of the blue and I didn't request that. So they know I'm going to call on them. So Mary Avalos has a question about resources. You were just talking about some of them, Vivian. I think she's interested in knowing a little bit more about what you've done. Mary, would you like to ask your question? Unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Vivian, for a wonderful presentation. I'm wondering if you've published any of these findings, and if so, where might we find them other than the resources you provided? But these overall findings that you provided today were very insightful. Thank you.
Oh, sure. It's almost like I anticipated this question. Thank you for asking it. And thank you for being first. I wanted to refer you to our website. We have, we have a section of our website, where we just talk about these research grants for folks who want to apply. But we created a set of resources for applicants who are interested in doing these studies. But I think it's useful for, anyone who's just interested in learning more about the findings from these studies. I probably did not do them all justice. There's such a rich array of work that has been coming out in lots of different sectors. And so if you go to that resources sections, we list publications, some of them more about theorizing, like what does research use look like, what influences it. There's a section on methods, and then there's a section on strategies for improving the use of research evidence. We've also got a short reading list of things that we're reading that are outside of our area, so in environmental policy or in healthcare, for example, because as I said, there's just wonderful work being conducted in other countries as well.
Well, that is a wonderful segue to the next question, which is from Leela Chakaya. Would you like to ask your question, Leela? And unmute yourself.
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks a lot, Vivian, for wonderful presentation. I know that William T. Grant Foundation focuses mostly on the US context. And I was wondering if you have worked at all on international context, and how do you think what you have presented today would apply to other contexts outside US?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. You are absolutely right. Our mission of the foundation is focused on children and youth in the United States. So in terms of what we fund, we have to stick with our core mission. But we have engaged a lot with this international community of scholars and funders doing this work. And I have been surprised over and over again at how much these overarching themes, overarching findings resonate across countries and across sectors, policy sectors. And part of it is some of these fundamental reasons that trust and relationships are core to a lot of this work. Whether it's trust between researchers and policymakers, researchers and practitioners. My colleagues who work in environmental science, for example, have been doing a lot of work around boundary spanning, which looks a lot like research practice partnerships in education in the US. Now, their partnership or boundary spanning work might be between fisheries managers, right? People who are managing these regional fisheries, it's a set of school districts, fisheries managers, and groups of researchers coming together to jointly define research questions, because apparently even in, those sectors, researchers are not answering the questions that folks need, environmental sustainability questions, or maybe they're wastewater treatment managers. When they start to talk, my environmental colleagues start to talk about international waters too, the folks who govern international waters and the sort of how fish breed and the flow of fish, again, it's a lot about lining up the research community with what policymakers need to know. Now, that's not to say there aren't differences. There are definitely differences. Like if you look at the US and the UK, the use of evidence in education, we have a much more decentralized system. We have something like 13,000 school districts across the country. They are able to work more directly with schools at the school level. And so there are certainly ways in which differences in our governance systems, the size and scope of our countries matter. But some of the overarching patterns are quite similar.
Thanks, that's very helpful, Vivian. We have another question. I think the restaurant and the food order analogy might have really resonated with people. And maybe Rebecca Maynard wants to push that analogy just a little further. Rebecca, can you share your question?
Sure. Thanks, Vivian. So I got into your analogy there, but I'm interested in how you think about the role of the kitchen and the wait staff in this, because in my experience, one of the best ways to create evidence that at least feels like it's being used more and used better involves what goes on in the kitchen, as well as what the customer comes into the restaurant hoping to order.
Okay, I'm going to try not to overstretch this, this analogy.
We could simplify this and just say, let me just put my cards on the table. I mean, I sort of think, in my experience, a lot of this actually is an iterative process between the consumer of the or the potential consumer of the information and the producer of the information. And sometimes as a producer, we produce things that aren't very useful, or we communicate them in non-useful ways. And the consumers sometimes don't aren't they want something else that may or may not be attainable. And sometimes trying to give them what they want isn't the best solution.
Yep. I think I've certainly come to the same conclusion based on my reading of the literature and also my sense of people's experiences trying to do this kind of work. I think it's that joint defining of a research agenda or the problems. Even we could just think about it as the problems folks are trying to solve, and then trying to delineate the ways research can help solve that problem is super important. But I would say the other dimension of it is that there is an iterative back and forth so that people can course correct. So for example, it's rarely one study or one set of findings that people go, oh, great, now I've solved it, and they move on, right? So even if they are implementing something, they're going to have later questions about why is it working here but not working here? Our staff are complaining about X or Y, and then those become the next set of research questions to answer. And so there's this iterative building up of an evidence base that helps practice. At the same time, I think that relationship also helps practitioners, because over time, they become better and better at identifying what research can be helpful on, right? And sometimes we do have a gut reaction. Oh, I would love information on X. Like, for example, I read a lot of books on how to eat well. I do not actually use the knowledge that I have, right? But the more I'm kind of engaged and can do this iterative thing, the better it is. And I think we see that with practitioners too. The more engaged they are in this joint process, the better they can ask the research questions and interpret what they're getting too. Like their research skills do actually increase. And I think Cynthia Coburn in her studies of partnerships finds that the practitioners over time will start asking the kinds of questions the researchers would have asked when research is presented to them, right? So, and that's why I've been a big fan of long-term relationships. not this like drop in and out, of collaborations, but sticking with things over time, that there's an additional value-added benefit that can come from it.
Okay, I want to just follow that up with some more questions about relationships and trust. Steve Fleischman has a question about that.
Hi, Vivian.
Hi, Steve.
So I have this question because I want to go back to relationships and trust. There were about 100, more than 100 folks on this webinar at one point, and my guess is that many of them have asked this question about what are some of the keys to effective promotion of research use. They would have said relationships and trust, and yet when folks interact with potential sponsors of work that is research-based and intended to promote research use, sponsors are often reluctant to kind of invest in relationships and trust because those are seen as activities, soft activities that are not outcomes-based, but kind of, a good time was had by all, but where are the results kind of point of view. So what are your thoughts around how to move the sponsor community to really seeing how important building relationships and trust are to the ultimate outcome? I think it's more than a logic model. It may be a campaign. It certainly has to be an elevator speech around how do you make the convincing statement. So what are your thoughts about this? And is anybody working on this particular question? How do you get sponsors to invest in building relationships and trust?
Yeah, I would say I may be a little more glass half full than you are about where funders are at on these issues. I would say that in recent years, 5 to 10 years, more and more funders have invested in research practice partnerships. I believe the Chicago Consortium now has an endowment. I'm looking at Penny, which is amazing, right? That's still the Chicago Consortium and not all the other consortiums out there. But when I look at the research practice partnerships, the birth of that, the growth, not the birth, but the growth of that field, a lot of that comes from a variety of funding sources, including local funders. The Houston Education Research Consortium has been supported by a lot of local funders, as the Chicago Consortium has in its long history. The federal government, National Science Foundation, has put a lot of money into research practice partnerships. I think IES, depending on leadership, it has come and gone. Under John Easton's leadership, when Ruth Neild was there was a lot of strong support for research practice partnerships. It's rolled back to some extent, so IES did cancel its RPP grant program under NCER. I still am hopeful that it will come back. So I think when I talk to foundations, I think that folks get the importance of relationships and trust. Now, I'm not saying we're funding them as a community nearly as much as we should be, but I think part of what needs to happen for funders is it causes us to shift the way we think about our funding. A lot of research is funded as projects. We fund a study, a project. It's really hard to sustain partnerships when you're constantly chasing money for one project, another project. And sometimes the projects that funders want to fund, the studies, don't actually align with what the practitioners need. And that's a very dangerous situation that we as funders need to be very attentive to, because are we actually pulling researchers, incentivizing researchers away from addressing the problems that their practitioner partners say they need to focus on? In addition, when folks are project focused, it takes away the time and energy from all that relationship building and joint discovery of like, what do we need to be solving together? Like, what is the big set of challenges we need to be going together? That takes time and a lot of resources. And so if we start to think about investing in infrastructure, I think of partnerships as infrastructure for producing more relevant research projects. So it's not just research projects or, partnership, it's both. But these become infrastructures that bring researchers and practitioners together as a foundation so that they can work together in more routine and productive ways. So I think the challenge for some funders is it's going to cause us to shift the way we think about what we're funding. And are we funding for the long term? Are we funding infrastructure? Or are we just funding projects?
It's very thought-provoking. Thank you, Vivian. We have, I'm going to go a little bit out of order here to try to keep some themes going, but please, I haven't forgotten about your questions. If you had a question that was asked earlier than the ones we're just asking, I'm coming back to you. There are some questions here about partnerships and also routines and practices. So I would like to, if you don't mind, Vivian, I'm wondering if we might want to take these three together. Is that too much? To sort of like, let's go sort of one right after another and sort of see if there's maybe a sort of a theme here. So Penny Sebring, would you be able to ask your question? And you might
Sure.
have other things to say about, based on what we were just talking about.
Sure. Would it be valuable if I stopped screen share so we can see each other?
I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Oh, good. This is much better.
Much better.
Hi, Penny.
Hi there. One thing we've been learning over the years is how valuable I'm with the U Chicago Consortium. And one thing we've been learning is how valuable it is to work with nonprofit groups to promote greater relevance of our research and use of our research. And just an example, about a year ago, we released a study on English learners, and we developed that study with the help of the Latino Policy Forum. And then when we were done with it, they just took us everywhere. They took us to the state. They took us to a parent advisory group of 400 parents. And, it was just really a wonderful partnership. And so I just wondered if that kind of partnership has figured into some of the research on research use.
Yeah. It's starting to, and I hope we will get more of it. We've started to fund some folks, and I think it's the folks who are thinking about equity issues that often bring this perspective to the fore, because of the way our systems are stratified racially in terms of immigration and all these other things. I think it's often the folks who are, whether they're concerned about racial equity or as you're saying, English learners or immigrant students, who think about the need to engage community-based organizations who are often led by or at least better represent marginalized communities, and how to bring them to the table in meaningful ways and setting research agendas and getting it used. And I really have to credit the Spencer Foundation, because when they sort of relaunched their RPP grant program, they were so explicit about saying practitioners should also include community organizations. And I think that, I'm noticing across the RPP field, like in the NERP network, more and more folks are grappling more deeply with how to engage both sets, both the district formal policymaking bodies, as well as community-based organizations. And I'm very hopeful, I'm half glass full, so that this will help bring research to the table in creating greater equity in our school systems. And we, some colleagues and I have been talking a lot about democratizing evidence. And I just don't know how we democratize evidence without bringing marginalized communities to the table in shaping the evidence agendas and being able to leverage evidence themselves to advocate for change. So I'm with you, Penny.
Thank you.
All right. We have a couple of questions about routines, incorporating evidence use into routines, using evidence more routinely, and some like +1s. Yes, I want to talk about that. So I think that's the next place we should go. And what I'd like is for Jorge Ruiz de Velasco to ask his question, followed right after by Beth Gamsey. And then let's take those two questions together. Jorge?
Sure. Vivian, it's great to see you, first of all. Thank you so much. I'll try to be succinct. So you talked a little bit about how important it was in effective data use when you can embed the research and research use in the organizational routines of the practitioners. And this is an issue that has been really explored much more so in the field of medicine than in education. In education, we think of the research practice partnership, co-design, co-production, co-validation as a way of improving the delivery of research and the improving the product. But could you say a little bit more about how engaging in research practice partnerships can actually model routines of inquiry that can build the capacity of the practitioner to use research over time, particularly in problematic implementation and adaptation of research? Use of modeling cycles of inquiry, use of data collection methods, logic modeling, asset mapping, system strategy mapping that can be embedded in departments and in schools and in teams and in collaborations with parents in usable ways by the practitioner.
Yeah. Sounds like you have some examples. Do you want to share one with us? It would, no, really.
Well, we're exploring in our work at the Gardner Center at Stanford, in our collaborations. Well, we'll hear from our practitioner partners, particularly professionals like principals and teacher leaders, that they need to build the capacity to engage in cycles of inquiry around the use of data, around a professional accountability and professional judgment in routine ways so that they can effectively implement research. And they look to the researchers to help model this. So we've been spending a lot of time logic modeling. And a lot of times practitioners say, oh, we've already done that. But one of the things we learn is it's routinely engaging in logic modeling as a routine practice is something you do to build the muscle to use data and to balance it and cohere it with the political and the social influences and the values.
Yeah.
This is one example.
Yeah,
but I'm sure there are others out there.
Yeah, and I think that it's terrific because part of what I'm hearing you talk about is it's a fuller sweep of things that researchers bring to the table in partnering with practitioners. I think sometimes researchers think too much, we have to offer our findings, results, what we know. But actually, if we're kind of working shoulder to shoulder with folks and helping them build their own capacity to collect data, to interpret it, and building up, their own muscles to do it. In a way, wouldn't it be great if then they don't even need us, right? And I think research practice partnerships, I'm thinking about Aaron Hendricks' framework, dimensions of effectiveness. One of the things a lot of partnerships say, that fifth dimension, is that they're trying to build capacity. capacity, including capacity among practitioners, as well as capacity in the research community. I'm not sure how much we've realized that part. It's a great aspiration. I'm glad it's part of the dimensions. But I think part of what you're describing is how do we see our role is also helping them build the capacity in a routine way to acquire or conduct research themselves. Some, you know, it could be both. I think oftentimes people could benefit from both. And what we have to offer is about the process, right? The scientific process and skills, not just findings. And I think the design research partnerships do that quite well, probably better than some of the other forms of partnerships.
Beth, would you like to add some questions or some additional perspective to this conversation about routines?
Sure. Hey, Vivian, nice to see you and thank you very much. I know you didn't really want to stretch the metaphor beyond what it could reasonably carry, but I'm trying to think about a couple of different things here, because going to a restaurant is in many cases a luxury. And if we want people to think about research as more akin to sustenance, which is sort of what George was describing too, it's sort of part of the package, right? You want it to be integrated into how people make decisions routinely, and it's not something that happens because it's exceptional when people rely on research. And we don't want it to be a CSA either, when you get a whole bunch of stuff that you don't necessarily ever cook because it's so much more of that one thing, right? You know, how much squash can you cook, right? So how can we think about making it easier for people to prioritize what it is that they want to learn about? Because we can't learn about everything. We can't do research about every single topic either. And that's one of the dangers of the routinization, is that it almost trivializes things. So I'm just curious to hear some of your thoughts about both routinizing it so that it becomes more a habit of practice, which is much easier to do in an RPP, and at the same time not trivializing what we might be able to learn.
Yeah. So I'm actually, my training is very mixed, but back in the day, I was more or less a cultural psychologist, cross-cultural psychologist, and who studied children and families. One of the things in that work is that you have to understand another cultural world, its internal workings, before you try to judge or evaluate it, right? And that's why we get this deficit model, because children of color, families of color were always, whatever differences they had from white middle class families were seen as deficits, because there was no appreciation of the internal richness and life within these families. When I came to this work, I had a sort of a similar mindset. I always heard researchers disparaging policymakers. If only they would do this, if only they would do that, they should do that. And so one of my greatest learnings has been to try to spend as much time as I can within their cultural world and understand it on its own terms, its own rhythms, its own priorities, before I try to, and not leap too quickly into my researcher hat, you know. And I think that, and so one of the most rewarding professional development things I've done when I first started this initiative was I gave myself a little, professional development program where I job shadowed school district leaders and managers. I would just follow them around all day. I was just, and all I was doing was learning. All I wanted to know is what kind of problems are they solving? What are they dealing with on a day-to-day basis? You know, what's going on, you know, sitting through union meetings, sitting through meetings with their staff, with the leadership team, all of this stuff. And that has provided some of the best insights I have for what we in the research community to do better to help them be more productive in their work, in their worlds. And I would love it if more researchers could do that, because I think it would help us better anticipate and plan for, even outside of a research practice partnership, you know, it would just help us better anticipate what is likely to be useful and how to work in more meaningful ways with them.
Thank you so much, Vivian. We have just a few minutes left, and we have 2 questions left. Sylvia Pooh has a question about the case study that you provided. So Sylvia will ask her question. And then after you finish talking about that, if you could just say a few words about democratizing education, which you have already said a bit about, but I think Jim Colmus would like to hear a bit more sort of about where that effort is. And so if you could just maybe finish up on that topic and then we'll close out. So Sylvia.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
I know we try not to circle back too much to the restaurant analogy, but I think I do want to at least use it to lead the stage, because I think when we talk about how to use research, I think so far we've been focusing really on researchers and practitioners, right? But in my own restaurant analogy, researchers and practitioners are all kitchen staffs. It's just like you have different roles, but the real customers that we're serving are the students or the communities that we're serving, right? So my question really, because of that background and my kind of own assumptions, my questions would be, I want to know more about going back to the setting the math standards case study. I would like to know more about how, after a decision's made, after say certain standards are developed, how are the standards implemented? What are the processes that are developed to help the students, especially those without adequate resources? And I think that's very important, especially since COVID has almost pushed to the foreground that we cannot take students as a whole community for granted. There are really so many disparities among all these students. So I was wondering if Vivian can just talk more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I love the way you're reframing the restaurant analogy. I'm going to take that away and think about it for my next presentation. Being very specific, because I can't get into all the details with this limited time, but I would refer you to the book that's Lorraine McDonald and Stephen Weatherford. It just came out late last year, where they go in through some of the case studies in 4 states. So I would refer you to some of that. I would also suggest looking at the work of Cynthia Coburn and some of her colleagues, but because they have studied at the district level implementation of math standards. And I think it'll get at some of that. More generally, I think we need much more research on implementation. And not implementation of evidence-based programs per se, but not implementation the way we've defined implementation sometimes in the academic community, but again, understanding what are the implementation questions that districts have, that schools have. And I think if we try to understand those, we're going to find that it's not the ways we've been studying implementation in our community. So, and that's what they're telling us they need. Right? So we got to really unpack that set of research questions better. Thank you, Sylvia. Oh, and then I was supposed to talk about
democratizing evidence and how it relates to research use. Yes.
Yeah.
Topic, but you only have 2 minutes. So.
Okay. Democratizing evidence at its core is taking basic democratic principles and applying them to the work of producing evidence and using evidence. And this means that the people most affected should have a seat at the table in defining evidence agendas. So this goes back to Penny's comments. It means that communities, students, especially those that have been racially marginalized or marginalized because of class, poverty, xenophobia, should have their own place at the table. If we're talking about using research for equity purposes, they need to have a place at the table in defining what those agendas are. And they should have a place and the ability to leverage research evidence and data towards the goals that they want to see in education. Because right now, the people who get access to research and data are the elites, whether they're academic elites or policy elites or people in formal decision-making roles who in some ways have more elite power, even if they don't feel like elites. But so it's making sure that communities, parents, young adults, adolescents, they too are fully equipped to leverage data and research evidence to make changes in education. So I think these are, I hope you guys recognize, basic democratic principles, but apply to this enterprise around evidence. That at its core is what it is. We also have a website on this. I will embed that. Thank you, Jim. I will embed that somewhere in the PowerPoint so that if any of you want to take a look at it, you can.
Thank you so much, Vivian. I think this has just been absolutely extraordinary. We've learned so much from you, as we always do. And thanks to all the participants for joining and for your questions and comments. Before you go, I just want to mention that there is another free webinar on research use that SREE is going to be sponsoring. It will be held on March 5th at 12 noon Eastern. And we will have a panel of people who are rigorously studying strategies for promoting research use. So it'll be, I think, another really fascinating session. Also take a look at SREE's spring convening, which goes from February 25th through March 5th. Sign up for that. And we hope that you'll also attend the SREE Fall Conference. So all sorts of good things coming up. Thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful day.